What's up, everyone? We have Tyler Leclerc from Lowell, Massachusetts, visiting, owner of TJL Training. Welcome. Great to have you here visiting DC.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
DC, this is your first time to Washington, DC.
Yep.
So we did some sightseeing today. We got Alex in the house. He's behind camera, so you can't see him. But today we have a pretty interesting topic that we're going to get into, which is 3 ways that you can dramatically improve your training session, either with your trainer or working on your own. So first, I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself, what you got going on in Lowell, Massachusetts, and then we can get into that topic.
Yeah, so like you said, my name's Tyler. I own my own facility in Lowell, Massachusetts, so I do a lot of private group training. I do clinics and then trying to continue to expand everything I do on social media. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist. I've been a full-time trainer for 4 years now. I played 1 year in college, decided I wanted to drop out, do training full-time, and now we're here.
Dope. So how old are you right now?
I am 24.
Another young whippersnapper,
Yep.
owning his own gym and doing his own thing. So very impressive. So let's get right into it. You know, we've talked off air about this, and, you know, there's been a lot of research in Rob Gray's book and all kinds of stuff. So what are 3 ways that you would advise someone to improve their skill development workouts or their training sessions?
My 3 things I'd say is small-sided games, using the constraints-led approach more, and then more variability within their practice sessions. They all very much depend on the time of the year, because obviously in season you might not need to use as much variability, trying to build the confidence. Same thing, maybe a little bit less small-sided games, all dependent, again, depending on the age, the kid that you have, everything's going to be a little different. But no matter what, if you implement those 3 things, I think you're immediately going to improve the quality of your workouts and also the results that you guys get.
Okay, cool. So let's go into it. What is a small-sided game, and can you give us some examples of
So
what that looks
a small-sided game is essentially just a smaller version of the game where you're adjusting the size, the scoring methods, the time. And again, it's just like a mini version of a game. So instead of it's 5-on-5 with a full court, maybe you're breaking it down into a 2-on-2 with a certain situation. Maybe you're adjusting the score or the time the players have. And it's just a good way for players to get a lot more condensed specific reps as opposed to 5-on-5, kind of like we were talking earlier. If you're in a 5-on-5, you can kind of hide. Like if you don't want to touch the ball, you can kind of just go to the corner. You don't have to touch the ball. You don't have to play defense. And in that case, you're not going to get better. So in a 2-on-2, it's like you can't hide. You have to get better. You're going to get touches. You're going to be in those situations, and it's going to force you to get better. So yeah, kind of example going off of that. So you got a 2-on-2. Maybe you're working on handoffs. Maybe you're working on finishing. We're just setting up essentially a situation that you're going to see in a game, and then just letting them play off of that.
Yeah.
Depending on how you want to do it, what your focus is, the constraints you want to place, there's endless possibilities with small-sided games, which I love.
Yeah, and the big thing is affordances, right? So affordances are just opportunities for action. And when we play a full game of 5-on-5, say like a pick and roll situation, you might only get 4 or 5 pick and roll situations in a game. But if we do the small-sided games, you might be able to get 20 live reps, 25, and moving around the defenders, they can just get different looks. So it's definitely a more efficient way of training, and also introducing kind of, you know, decision making into the process. Is small-sided game something you probably do like every workout with a group training session? Yeah,
pretty much. Like I'd say 90% of my group trainings is all small-sided games. And I think the biggest thing, like you were saying, the decision-making part of it is that's where the disconnect is, where it's like, oh, I'm going to go in the gym, I'm going to get better, but there's no decision-making. There's never a time in a game where you're not making a decision. There's never a time where you're going to shoot where you didn't have to think about it. So it's like we need to be training those decisions just as much we're training the technique or the skill is what people call it, when it's obviously a lot deeper than that. So that's another great benefit of small-sided games, that we're training decision-making as well as the skill as well as everything else that goes along with it.
Yeah, and that's probably why using just cones is probably not an efficient way of training, just because there is no perception action, there's no decision-making, right? So I can understand the use of cones for, you know, there is a time and place for cones for maybe delineating boundaries or setting up, you know, if you don't have other people, like I could see a reason for cones, but ultimately for small-sided games and decision-making, it's probably not the best use, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, cool. So going into kind of constraints-led approach, can you maybe describe what that means to you and then how you use it?
The biggest way that I kind of, I guess, explain it or look at it is more of a way to teach without teaching. So it's like I can get a player to do X without telling them we're going to do X. So it's, say we want to work on the fluidity of your shot. I'm going to say, hey, let's back up being able to shoot without jumping. So that constraint of them not being able to jump is going to force them to find a solution, and I'm allowing them to find it on their own based on within the constraints that I give them. So depending on the skill you want to teach, whether it's shooting, whether it's finishing, whether it's movement, by placing that constraint, you're narrowing their opportunities and movement solutions to kind of guide them into that solution that you are, as the coach, trying to find. So in my way, it's just like a way of teaching without teaching, which is much more beneficial than teaching very explicitly.
Right, because you're almost trying to guide people to find their own solution. So it's almost like you own the solution and versus it being top-down information processing where people are told the information. Maybe can you provide some examples of constraints that you use for finishing and then maybe some constraints that you would use for shooting, just so people have certain ideas of how they can implement it in drills?
So a couple different examples with constraints for shooting, I might say.
I mean, obviously it depends on the goal, right?
Exactly. So
I didn't give you a goal, but you can come up with one.
So say one goal is like the player always misses short because they're very flat on their shot. I'm going to say we have to make 10 shots without hitting front rim. So that constraint's just going to force them to maybe think, okay, maybe I'm going to try to shoot a little higher. Or I'm going to say if they keep shooting left because whether their follow through is going left or they're pushing with their offhand, I'm going to say, hey, you can't hit left rim. So just with that simple constraint, it might force them into a different movement pattern. I like to use constraints a lot within the small sided game. So a couple examples would be like, say we're starting in hip to hip situation, finishing wise, I might say, hey, you can't finish with your left hand, or you can't finish using the backboard. So it's like, all right, now we got to learn to floaters. And another one I like to do, same thing, hip to hip, no layups. So it's like now you got to find a floater, you got to create contact. So it just changes, like you were saying, your field of affordances and just forcing you to find new movement solutions.
Yeah, so for like shooting, I could see someone for a constraint for someone who has a very low release. It would be like, you put your hand at a certain location and you don't have to tell them to increase the height of their arc or shoot a little bit higher, right? Because what's going to happen, they're obviously going to get blocked, right? So I do think it's a great way to teach because it forces people to, just kind of what we just said, come up with their own solutions, but you're not telling them like there's only one way. You're kind of letting them figure out, because everyone's body's slightly different and unique. And so do you have any for defense? Like, do you guys work defense at all? Or?
Trying to think. I'll do some stuff where we'll start in certain situations and I'll say you can't use your hands. So it's like, all right, we're racing to this corner or this elbow, and it's like you can't use your hands. So you really got to get there with your feet. So that might be one of them. Or you got to keep your hands above your shoulders, so you can't bring your hands down. So you got to move your feet more and just be a little bit smarter on defense. So I'll do stuff with that. It's really just like in the moment where it's like, because there's endless possibilities, right? But it's about what is the goal and then reverse engineering that back, and then how can I place a constraint to get to that end goal without teaching them or without telling them what that is, or teaching them explicitly what we're trying to teach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How do you decide in a workout? So the whole point of using constraints-led approach is for us to give less verbal cues, right? Yep. So when you decide to talk in a workout, what kind of feedback are you giving, or what kind of information are you giving to your athletes?
I always try to say the most with the least. So it's like, if I can say it in a word, I'm not going to say a whole sentence. And if I can say it without saying anything, as in just my body language or just like a hint or a question, I'll do that. If I'm going to say something, I always try to go with an analogy, because it's going to stick better for them. If that doesn't work, then maybe I'll get a little more explicit, or maybe I'll just show them. But it's always kind of, don't say anything, just show them, give them a hint, ask them a question, say a word. If that doesn't work, maybe I go to a sentence, then maybe I go to an analogy. If that doesn't work, then I'll kind of explain it a little bit more in detail. But I think most coaches do the opposite, where it's like, kid didn't get something, I'm just going to fully explain it. I'm going to dive into a 5-minute analysis on why they need to do this, this, and this, as opposed to kind of doing it the other way.
So here's an interesting, here's another question is, how do you, I guess, explain that to a parent? Do you explain the whole small-sided game, constraints-led approach to the parents, or how do you convince the parents who are, watching some of these youth kids that are coming in, that this way is superior? Obviously you can tell them like, take it or leave it, but what is kind of like the 3-sentence synopsis of summarizing that for them?
Yeah, that's something that's very crucial, because kind of like we were just talking about with the jiu-jitsu stuff, is like when you first come in, for you, what you're doing is like, the coach isn't saying it a lot. You're like, oh, like, does he care about me? All this stuff. So it's very easy. Like, if kids are coming into my sessions, just seeing small-sided games, not seeing me talk a lot, they're like, he's not even training. Like, it doesn't look like I am, but obviously I am. So it's just trying to communicate that of what my method is, and like, I'm not gonna be like every other coach.
Yeah.
My goal is to be a guide, not to be explicit and yell at them and tell them every single thing that they need to do, and kind of just explain why I do that. Like, I'm going to put them in these situations because this is over time what I've found to be more beneficial for them, and just kind of explain, like you said, in as simple terms as possible and what they will understand. And I think it was harder at first because I didn't have enough like proof that it works. Yeah. But now I think I have a lot more kids where it's, and a lot more of a reputation, at least in the local area, of like, he does a really good job. He knows what he's talking about, so I trust him. So at first it's like, you got to really explain that because they don't get it. They just walk in and they see what they see. But now at least most of the kids that come to me understand what I do and understand the value that I bring, and they kind of just trust it. But you always still got to communicate that.
So I know you try to use less words, but when you are giving cues, you know, there's the internal cues versus the external cues. Have you found yourself changing more from not using those internal cues? Would probably be something like snap your wrist more, something like change your feet, bend down a little, bend your knees a little bit more, versus, you know, external cue would be back rim, that kind of stuff. Have you shifted your language as well in that, or do some people actually, have you found some people respond better to internal cues?
I always try to go more external cues. I think for the most part, like, I always try to, at least first when I was switching, I'd catch myself. Now at this point, I think pretty much everything I say is external. Yeah. If a kid's just absolutely not getting it, I might explain it internally, but I want my cues to be external. It's going to force them to think less. Like, the more they're going to think about every little movement, the more that's going to freeze their movement patterns. So, and then also when they revert back in a game where it's like, all right, game's on the line, they're going to revert back to how they learned it. Right. If they learned it internally, they're going to start to think more about the movement, which is going to mess it up. You're going to have less accuracy. You're going to have lower percentages, all that kind of stuff. But if they learned it through like an analogy, like I was saying, or through an external cue, they don't have all that internal dialogue. So they don't have nothing to revert back to in terms of, oh, I got to snap my wrist, I got to put my fingers this way, I got to bend my knees. So that movement's going to be a lot more fluid and smooth. They're going to be more clutch and have higher percentages when it counts.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard with the internal cues because it's how much, right? So you tell. The reason I ask is because a lot of people say, like, snap your wrist. Well, it's like, well, how much more? Yeah. Like, bend your knees. Well, how many more degrees? Like, we don't know exactly, or elbow in a little bit more. It's like, it's hard to really quantify how much, right? So if we just give an external cue of go for the back rim, we just allow the athlete's brain to self-organize and figure out, like, okay, I'm going for back rim, right? Versus, you know, I think back, I don't know if you remember, but I think Kyle Korver had a 17-point checklist that he would go through.
Really?
Yeah. I've been meaning to Google this, but he has this thing where he says he goes through all 17 things in his head before he shoots. But I don't think it's possible. But it was kind of talking about like his wrist, 90 degrees, elbows in, that kind of stuff. But it just shows you too, like, we think like that's what's going on, but, you know, research has shown that's not really what's going on in our brain. And that's why, like, for coaches, it's important to figure out like what those external cues are going to be able to guide our athletes, and not always trying to tell them the exact solution, because honestly, it's like, we would like to say we knew the exact solution, but I think it's pretty hard for us to pinpoint, like, for sure, this is why you're short, right? Yeah. So
yeah, it's definitely like a lot of like trial and error too. It's like that a lot with like analogies too, where the external cues, like, you try one thing, doesn't click for the athlete. You say a different one, doesn't click, and then you find the one that does, and then you just stick with it and you keep repeating it. You keep using the same analogy or the same cue once you find it.
Cool. So let's talk about the third thing. You talked about variability. What is variability and why is it important?
Yeah, so on the other side of that, we have block practice. Block practice is just doing the same exact skill over and over again. So say you're catch and shoot jump shots, you're shooting at the same spot 5-10 times in a row. You're not interrupting that skill with any other skill. Variability is where we're interrupting that skill. So say maybe it's a corner catch and shoot, we're sliding up to the wing, and then we're going to get another catch and shoot, or maybe we're interrupting it with a different skill. There's obviously layers to variability. Nothing's binary in that sense. It's obviously on a spectrum. But we're just essentially interrupting the skill, and then how much we interrupt that skill is going to allow us to dictate the challenge that we're providing to that player, which is where we're going to see, obviously, the more advanced they are, the more variability we need to present. So that way we're presenting more challenge, which is going to help improve and strengthen skills. So if we're just doing block practice, we're not presenting enough skill for the athlete to strengthen skills. And then that's where the variability comes in, where it's like we're able to create that challenge where they can start to strengthen skills. So it's essentially just a tool that presides on a spectrum. You have to know how to use it, just like any other tool as a trainer. But yeah, that's kind of just the main premise of it.
And then how would you decide how much variability based on the athlete, right? And based on skill, right? If you have an athlete who is more of a novice, you're going to reduce the variability, the amount of variability you want, right? Because he needs to stabilize the skill of being able to shoot versus you have someone like Steph Curry or Manny come in the gym, someone who's a great shooter. You're trying to make it kind of as challenging as possible, right? So what would be a few of maybe your favorite or go-to ways to switch things up for, let's say, like catch and shoot shooting or off the dribble shooting?
So like if we're going off the catch, maybe the first layer will just be another catch and shoot shot. And then maybe another layer off of that is we're going to go catch and shoot to an off the dribble shot. So we're just kind of really changing the skill. And then maybe we're going catch and shoot to a floater. And then we're getting back into a catch and shoot. So we're going from kind of doing the same skill to doing less of the same skill to doing a completely different skill. And then if we want to add more variability, maybe we add in a third rep where it's like catch and shoot, floater, tack the rim, lay up with defense, and then go back to the corner.
So almost like spaced repetition, right? You're almost trying to get them to forget that initial skill when they come back.
Exactly. So they have no reference of, I shot this shot, it was a little bit off, so I'm just next rep, I'm going to adjust it, where it's like you have to completely forget that. Now you have no reference and you go back to that first rep. And it's essentially like you're just doing it all over again, brand new.
Yeah. So one thing I like for variability as well is just for like that method to me is like a spaced repetition method, or I don't know if it's actually called spaced repetition, but one way that, I use with Jeremy is bad passing. That's like a interesting way of variability because I'm passing it high, low, left, right. They have to be able to get into the shot pocket. Another way I've seen variability used is say like a simple through the legs into your shot. I will ask them to change the angle of the through the legs. So sometimes it'll be parallel, sometimes it'll be further back. Then I'll ask them from there, like you can't have the same angle, same length, and then same speed. So at one time I want you to go really hard, bounce as hard as you can. Then sometimes I want it to be like a delayed soft into your shot. But the whole purpose of that is variability is we're training adaptability, right? We want athletes to not, as soon as a defender does a certain way or for some reason they're a little bit tired or they can't do what they normally train, like we want them to be able to shoot other shots, right? I think that other example I gave you is like having an athlete just change the arc on their shot, which you would think like, wouldn't you want to build consistency? But what if it's like the end of a game and someone's actually trying to block your shot and you have to change your arc to 54 degrees? Are you going to say like...
You have different defenders who are different heights. So it's like if you have Mo Bamba contesting you got to shoot it higher versus Muggsy Bogues. You can shoot with a different arc.
Yeah, so like just having the ability to change. But if you've never practiced it, it's going to be a tough situation. What about finishing? Do you have like stuff that you work for variability and shooting?
So
well, obviously the finishings is going to be very variable, but like what are ways that you train that?
I like trying to hit different areas of the backboard, or maybe we're going to go from swishing to banking to maybe hitting the block to not hitting the block, going finger rolls to actually using the backboard, so no backboard, things like that.
I think you also had the one where it was like shoulder to elbow, shoulder to hip, like different movements with the ball.
Alex came up with that one. Just hit different areas of your body and then finish. I like ones where like they'll be attacking the rim without the ball. I'll throw it up myself. They got to catch it, so they never know where they're going to catch it. And then that's also like just why I love small-sided games is because every rep has variability. Because you have a defender, so you have to change, you have to adapt. You can't do the same exact thing over and over again, or you're just defense going to catch on, you're going to get blocked. So that's why I just love, because I don't have to. Not that I don't want to think about it, but it's like now you're getting game-like variability. You
brought up the block practice versus random practice and variability. I would say a lot of trainers or coaches would say, well, the top players have all done block practice, or they all do block practice shooting. Kyrie does. I've seen Kyrie and KD do a lot of block practice, a lot of just regular finishing, right? How did they get to their level? With that type of practice?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is like you see Kobe, you see Steph, but most of the highlights that you see or workout clips are in season. And you're also seeing them at the pinnacle of their careers. So we're thinking, okay, that's what they did to get there, but is that really how they got there? Because oftentimes what you see them doing in season, what you see them when they're already in the league, is very different from what actually got them to the league. So my question would be, is that what got them there, or is that what they're doing once they did get there?
So we were having this discussion earlier. What is your hypothesis? What are the contributing things that you think that get them there?
I think just a lot of playing as a kid. Like most of the players that you see in the NBA, they got a ball in their hands at a very young age. They played lots of pickup. They had lots of freedom. They played multiple other sports, and they didn't have a coach telling them, this is right, this is wrong, don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah, I definitely think the aspect of, if you're the son of an NBA player and you have access to other professional players, and if you're gifted, like LeBron was identified, I think it was like when LeBron was in 8th grade, I think he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated then when he was like the chosen one, and they were saying like he could play in the NBA right now as an 8th or 9th grader. So at that point, like you're gonna be playing with other NBA players, other top level players. So you're always getting constant exposure of playing against the top talent, which is a constant form of iteration. And going back to Kyrie, I think I remember hearing an interview with, when he has that plastic bag story where he used to dribble around with the plastic bag, which is cool. I've tried that actually myself. But the other story I heard in an interview was that he would always try to finish on different spots on the backboard. He would see like, hey, can I finish from this angle hitting this part of the backboard? And to me, that was like the inherent practice of variability and also understanding angles and the principles of figuring out those shots early on and just getting a lot of reps. That's something that's not done, right? What are we taught? We're taught to go right hand layup. We jump off your left foot, right? There's very little variability, which I can understand. Like if you bring a new kid in, it's hard to, and they've never played basketball, right? We have to start somewhere. So it is a interesting, thought experiment to think about like how, because ultimately we're trying to reverse engineer their success. And there's clearly they're genetically gifted. Clearly they're physically talented as well. And there's a lot of other things, and you could talk about where they grew up and maybe they had a coach who did have some of this, right? It's an interesting thought experiment to continue doing. I guess for you, like, what have you changed your philosophy, or are there things that you've changed training wise at your gym in the last year or so, in terms of like something maybe you started with and you were like, I'm going to do this, and then after a few months you were kind of like, thinking about it more, I want to change it?
A progressive, just more and more heavily into the small sided games, less verbal teaching, less actually giving them on-air drills and stuff like that. And obviously I have that in my individual training because I don't have a group, but for all my group training, it's just literally just from start to finish small-sided games.
Yeah. I think, I often say this, the biggest mistake with Jeremy early on is like not having enough 5-on-5 competition or just live competition. And we would do the small-sided games, but we're trying to use small-sided games to transfer to 5-on-5. But you could also just play 5-on-5 and tell them to execute, what you've been working on too, because that's going to be ultimately the closest, and the better the competition. If you got other NBA guys, that's as close to the game as it's going to get. And I think early on there was too much small-sided games, too much block practice, and not a lot of that 5-on-5, that when we did get back to maybe preseason or later in the off season and he did start going against bigger guys, it would be like there was this gap. And I think that's what you're always trying to reduce, is there shouldn't be this gap of training between like what you're doing and then like what skill transfer is on the court. So I think like you rectify that by, it seems like at your court the guys play like 3-on-3. There's a lot of 1-on-1, that kind of stuff.
I ideally would be able to do like we try to do in the summer. It was a lot of 5-on-5, like at least once a week, because also to your point, like if you're doing all these small-sided games, then you want to see them go and try it in the game and then see how they're picking up on it. Because maybe they're getting it really well and, okay, now we can move on, progress a little bit, or they're really struggling. So, okay, maybe next week we focus a little bit more heavily on this skill within small-sided games. So it's a good, like, test and then come back to the drawing board on, like, the micro scale. So I think that's really beneficial. But, yeah, like, I think within my training, within the groups, kids get a lot of opportunity with the 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3. I think they get enough, at least with the high school kids, because they're always playing. They always got leagues. They always got AAU games. So I think they get enough games in terms of that. But I wish I had, because I only have half court, I wish I had a full court where kids can kind of just get more free 5-on-5, because I think a lot of kids don't get like the unsupervised 5-on-5. So I wish that was something like I could offer, but
then you have to set rules so that you're going to cherry pick. Because when I was playing 5-on-5 as a kid, it was just straight up cherry picking.
Yeah.
Cool. My final question for you is, obviously everything we've talked, small-sided games require other individuals, more people on the court. There's plenty of kids or athletes that are listening that don't have access to a trainer, don't have access to somebody else, and they're going to the court and they want to work on their game. And honestly, that's what I had to do. Like I didn't have someone, I had to walk to the nearest court or in my driveway and work out. Like couldn't always set up like, hey, can you come over so we can do a small-sided game in this pick and roll situation so I can get opportunities for action? I guess for those people listening, how would you advise them in what are some simple tips that they can work on to improve their training?
I'd say kind of like we were talking about with the variability, try to explore with different things like that. So maybe kind of like the Kyrie thing, like if you're doing layups, don't do the same layup every time. Don't try to hit the same backboard. Maybe you do the same layup, trying to hit different areas of the backboard. Or maybe you just mix up the layups. Like, because I like you see all the kids like we talked about earlier. You come in, you get the 5-spot shots, make the one move into the same layup. So it's like just really try to explore, be creative. Don't think like everything has to be 5 makes of this, 5 makes of that, and it has to be very sequential. The other thing that I like to do is like give them a constraint and then let them do anything else within that. So maybe it's like we're working on 1-2 pull-ups or 1 dribble pull-up. It's like see how many 1 dribble pull-ups you can come up with that are slightly different. So this is when we can start to explore doing the same thing, but doing it in as many different ways as we can. So take a 1 dribble pull-up, see how many different minor changes you can make, where it's 1-2 into your jump shot, little shot fake, fade away, 1-2, step back, whatever. Like you can come up with 50 different ways to shoot a 1 dribble pull-up. Do the same thing for 2 dribble. Do the same thing for a scoop finish. Do the same thing for extensions. I think just being able to be creative and expressing that within sessions is a good use of your time when you're on your own, because when you're within a session with doing small-sided games, you're being able to be very specific. You're very game-like. So when you're by yourself, don't be afraid to really stretch that non-game-like stuff and really get creative and really try different things. Because like we were talking about, a lot of the people that make it to the league, that get to the highest levels, they were at the park just trying random shit. They're going up, going through the leg layups, 360 layups, and they were just really exploring and kind of exploring what they're capable of. And then I think that's a good use of your time by yourself. Use the variability. Find different ways to challenge yourself in terms of utilizing time, keeping track of stuff. So it's maybe you're working on your 3-point shooting. Give yourself 3 minutes. How many threes can you make? Next time you do it, you got to beat the score. Because if you're just shooting, okay, there's no challenge. There's nothing to beat. There's nothing you're working towards. Utilizing time, utilizing score, I think is a good way to kind of just challenge yourself by yourself. Add a little bit more pressure, make it feel a little bit more game-like while there's no one there. I think you do those 3 things, that's a good way to just easily boost your workouts.
Yeah. And there's so many other variabilities. Like everything you said, you could just change the speed, right? So do everything you just said, 1 dribble combo, 2 dribble combo. So now you're doing 1 fast, 1 slow, 1 super fast. With the 3 dribble combos, there should be a lot of or even 3 or 4. There's so many combinations you can come with, and then you can then change footwork, off right, left right. So those are just going backwards, maybe going forwards, going sideways. Those are all different ways that you could probably change up the workout and make it more challenging. I would add also just stretching yourself, right? Always like pushing yourself to the point of failure. So if you're doing a dribble, see like how hard you can go till like you lose control, right? And then if you lose control, like obviously you're like, oh, that's too far, and then try to back off from that. But like pushing yourself to those points of failure, I think rarely happen, because what do we want to do when we go to the park? We'll say like, oh, I'm going to make 10 in a row. I want to make 50 shots today, right? It's not like, no one ever thinks like, let me put myself to the edge. Well, I mean, maybe some people do, but like how far can I take off from, or how fast can I shoot it? Like I thought Carmelo provided a great analogy of like, people always ask him like, how's your shot so quick? And he said he used to play a game when he was a kid, like the ball was like a hot potato, and he would just, in his mind, like that visual cue of like a hot potato, just trying to let it go, and he would speed it up. And he does have one of, a really fast release. And then also I haven't gone too much into the research, but just like the visualization, like I think that could be beneficial, of just creating somewhat of an environment, like visualizing a defender coming, visualizing the clock, like feeling that type of environment. I think could be beneficial versus like, oh, I'm just in the street, like messing around, like whatever, like putting some of that external pressure on yourself. And then, I don't know, when we were kids, we used to shoot in all kinds of different environments. It was cold, You got the Larry Bird who's like shoveling snow and
Yep.
shooting free throws when it's like dark out, when it's
Yep.
cold out. So I think those are all like different ways for training. So
Yeah.
I think those are super great tips. Any books or podcasts you want to plug for further education that you've kind of that helped you along the way for this last year?
Language of Coaching is a great one. The Rob Gray's book is a great book. I mean, skill acquisition in
Language of
sport.
Coaching, is that Winkleman?
Yeah, Nick Winkelman.
Okay.
Skill acquisition in sport, talent code, culture code.
Yeah.
I mean, I could name 50, but I don't got them all off the top of my head. But those are some great
That was a
ones.
great list. That's a
Yeah.
great list there. And then any podcast that you enjoy listening to? Cool.
Podcast, don't listen to too much. TC's got a good podcast, been on his a couple. Listen to Joe Rogan a lot, but I don't think he needs a plug.
Cool. Well, appreciate you coming in, being at the house, visiting, and great to have you here, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.